A fragment of bone, dense and dark with age, is lifted from the earth and carried into a clean laboratory light. It does not look revolutionary. It does not announce a lost world. It is only a fossil scrap from an animal that vanished near the end of the last ice age. But inside that fragment, locked beneath mineral and time, there was a record older than any argument paleontologists had ever made about the creature it came from. For more than a century, the dire wolf seemed easy to place. Bigger than a grey wolf. Heavier in the jaw. Built to crush and hold. A familiar predator from a familiar family. Its very name encouraged certainty. Wolf. A harsher wolf, perhaps. A more powerful wolf. But still, unmistakably, a wolf. And yet the evidence preserved in those ancient remains would eventually force a far stranger conclusion. The animal we called the dire wolf may have looked like a wolf, hunted like a wolf, and occupied much the same ecological role as a wolf. But when ancient DNA was finally recovered and compared, the story stopped being simple. The question was no longer how dire wolves differed from grey wolves. The deeper question became why two animals could resemble each other so strongly, live in overlapping worlds, and still be divided by an ancestry far older than almost anyone had imagined. That is where this mystery begins, not in myth, not in television, not in legend, but in the forensic logic of bone, teeth, molecules, and time. Long before genetics entered the case, the dire wolf had already become an icon of Pleistocene North America. Thousands of specimens were pulled from the tar seeps at Rancho La Brea in Los Angeles, one of the richest fossil sites in the world. Their skulls were broad, their teeth robust, their bodies built for power rather than speed. Compared with living wolves, the resemblance seemed obvious. So obvious, in fact, that the classification held for generations. Dire wolves were placed beside other canids as a close relative of the grey wolf, perhaps a new world branch with a more specialized anatomy. That conclusion was not foolish. It was the most reasonable reading of the evidence available at the time. Paleontology often begins with form. If the skull is similar, if the limbs articulate in familiar ways, if the teeth tell the story of a social predator capable of bringing down large prey, then kinship can appear almost self-evident. Science had built an entire picture around that self-evidence. But morphology has limits. Bones tell the truth, yet not always the whole truth. Evolution can produce resemblance without close family ties. Separate lineages under similar pressures can converge on similar solutions. A deep chest, powerful neck, shearing teeth, coordinated hunting behavior, these are not signatures of identity so much as answers to the same brutal equation. If two predators are shaped by the same prey, the same landscapes, the same need to kill efficiently, they may begin to echo one another. For years, that possibility remained only a suspicion. The real obstacle was technical. Ancient DNA is fragile, easily destroyed by heat, moisture, chemistry, and time. Recovering it from Ice Age carnivores is not like opening a sealed archive. It is more like retrieving a sentence from ashes. Most of what once existed is gone. What remains is fragmented, damaged, contaminated, and incomplete. You do not read it so much as reconstruct it. Then the fragments began to speak. Researchers extracted and sequenced genetic material from dire wolf fossils found across the Americas, including remains more than 50,000 years old. This alone was a significant achievement. The samples were old, the preservation uneven, and the challenge was substantial. But the real shock came after the comparisons began. Instead of clustering neatly with grey wolves, coyotes, and other living wolf-like canids, the dire wolf lineage stood apart. Not slightly apart. Not as a nearby cousin. Deeply apart. The genetic split appeared to reach back roughly 5.7 million years. That is not the timescale of a recent branch within the same familiar group. That is a separation so ancient that it changes the category of the animal in your mind. Dire wolves were not simply oversized grey wolves with a dramatic name. They represented the last known members of a much older lineage native to the Americas, one that had been running alongside other canids for millions of years before disappearing. In that moment, the fossil fragment in the laboratory became more than a specimen. It became evidence that an entire evolutionary identity had been misread. And the implications did not stop there. One of the most revealing parts of the genetic work involved admixture, whether dire wolves had interbred with the ancestors of grey wolves or coyotes when their ranges overlapped. Among many canids, hybridization is not unusual. Modern wolves, coyotes, dogs, and related species have complicated histories of gene flow. Their boundaries, while real, are often porous. This made the dire wolf case even more intriguing. If these animals lived in the same broad world, if they were shaped by similar ecological demands, and if they were long assumed to be close relatives, then some level of interbreeding might have seemed plausible. But the ancient DNA did not support that expectation. The dire wolf appears to have remained genetically isolated from the lineages that produced gray wolves and coyotes. That missing link, the hoped-for bridge between appearance and ancestry, was not there. The resemblance had misled the eye, and the genome refused to cooperate with the old story. This is the kind of reversal that science occasionally delivers with unusual force. It does not merely adjust a detail. It changes the meaning of the evidence we thought we understood. Suddenly the dire wolf's familiar features looked less like proof of close relation and more like evolutionary mimicry on a grand timescale. The skull, the bite, the body plan, those were not family markers after all. They were ecological solutions independently arrived at by a lineage facing similar realities. And once that door opened, the dire wolf became stranger with every step. Its power had long been recognized. Dire wolves carried stout limbs and formidable jaws suited to processing large prey. In the late Pleistocene, North America held an extraordinary assembly of big animals: horses, bison, camels, ground sloths, mammoths, and other megafauna. Predators responded accordingly. Dire wolves were part of that immense predator guild, sharing the continent with saber-toothed cats, American lions, and short-faced bears. They were not just wolves in a harsher world. They were participants in an ecological drama far richer and more dangerous than the modern landscapes we know. But if dire wolves belong to an ancient lineage of their own, then their extinction takes on a harsher edge. They were not replaced by close cousins who carried the line forward in altered form. They ended. Their branch went dark. Why? No single explanation solves the case completely, and serious evidence rarely permits a neat closing argument. But several lines point in the same direction. Dire wolves were highly specialized for a world crowded with large prey. As the late Ice Age ended, climates shifted, habitats changed, and many of the megafaunal species they likely depended on declined or vanished. Human expansion added new pressure to ecosystems already destabilizing. Predator communities were reorganized. Food webs thinned. In that upheaval, flexibility mattered. Gray wolves appear to have been more adaptable. They could range widely, exploit different prey, and, perhaps just as importantly, remain connected to living canid networks through gene flow and demographic resilience. Dire wolves, by contrast, may have faced the crisis as a more isolated lineage, one without the evolutionary interchange that sometimes helps populations endure changing conditions. That point is easy to miss, but it matters. Extinction is not always about weakness in the obvious sense. Sometimes it is about being too singular in a world that stops rewarding singularity. The dire wolf may have been extraordinarily well made for one age and poorly positioned for the age that followed. Even its name now carries an unintended irony. Dire wolf survived because the bones survived, because the silhouette survived, because the image was compelling enough to persist through museums, textbooks, and popular culture. Yet genetically, the animal behind that name may have been distant enough from true wolves that some researchers revived an older classification, placing it in a separate genus, Enoscion, often translated as terrible wolf. The debate over names is secondary to the deeper discovery, but it captures the shift beautifully. We did not just learn something new about a wolf. We learned that the label itself had been hiding the real story. What ancient DNA revealed was not a minor correction. It exposed a failure of intuition. That failure is fascinating because it reminds us how often the past resists our categories. We imagine evolution as a tidy family tree with clear resemblances and predictable branches. In reality, it is also full of echoes, disguises, and convergences. Animals can arrive at nearly the same form by traveling very different historical roads. A skull can mislead. A tooth can flatter an assumption. An entire species can stand in plain view and still be misunderstood for 100 years because it fits too neatly into a story we are ready to believe. The dire wolf forces a wider humility. How many extinct creatures do we still interpret through living analogies that are only partly true? How many ancient ecosystems looked familiar from a distance but were, up close, assembled from lineages with no modern equivalent? The Ice Age was not just our world with larger mammals. It was another arrangement of life, dense with experiments that did not survive into the present. There is also something unexpectedly poignant in the forensic outcome. Dire wolves were once imagined as part of an unbroken wolf narrative, as though their disappearance still left descendants and analogues carrying their essence forward. Ancient DNA stripped away that comfort. These animals were more alone than we thought. They were the end of something older, a final remnant of a lineage already ancient while early human ancestors were still deep in prehistory. And that changes the emotional weight of the fossil record. At Rancho La Brea, the abundance of dire wolf remains has always been striking. Their bones lie by the thousands, testimony to a predator that was not marginal or rare. They were successful, numerous, dominant enough to leave a heavy signature in the earth. Yet abundance can create its own illusion. It can make extinction feel improbable, even temporary. The genome corrects that impression with cold precision. No matter how numerous dire wolves once were, no matter how strong, how well armed, how visually familiar, their lineage did not continue. The traces ended in the late Pleistocene, and for 10,000 years the truth of their identity remained buried inside the bones themselves. That may be the most arresting part of the story. The remains were never absent. The evidence was physically present all along. Museums held it. Tar pits yielded it. Papers described it. Illustrators reconstructed it. But the decisive clue could not be read until the tools existed to detect it. In that sense, the dire wolf did not change. We changed. Our ability to interrogate the dead became sharper, and an old certainty collapsed under better light. So when we picture the dire wolf now, we should picture it a little differently. Not as a brutal cousin of the grey wolf, looming just beyond history, but as the last visible representative of a much deeper American canid past. An animal shaped into wolf-like form by the demands of predation, yet separated from wolves by millions of years of hidden divergence. Familiar in outline. Alien in ancestry. The fossil fragment on the laboratory table was never dramatic to look at. It did not need to be. It contained a correction large enough to redraw a species. And perhaps that is what makes discoveries like this so enduring. They remind us that the past is not silent, it is merely waiting for the right question. If this is the kind of history you like exploring, you're welcome to stay with the channel for more. For now, the final image is simple, a wolf-shaped predator stepping through Ice Age grass, recognizable at first glance, and then, once the genetic evidence is known, no longer recognizable in quite the same way again.